Hello and welcome to some training on adverse childhood experiences and trauma. I'm Jo Hopkins and I'm the Programme Director for Public Health Wales for ACEs, Criminal Justice and Violence Prevention. And today I'm just going to take you through some of the research around adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed practice and how that can help support people who are displaced and have come to the UK. So this course may actually contain some things that might be quite upsetting for some people. So if you think you are affected by any of the content, then please look for support from your line manager, from your local occupational health team or the equivalent. And at the end of this presentation, there are numbers for organisations that you can contact for support. Some of this stuff is really tricky, so please be aware of your self-care. Stop the training if you feel you need a break, step away and talk to people if you find it something that you want to discuss further. So today we're just going to go through a number of different sections, starting with thinking about what stress and the trauma response is, what are adverse childhood experiences and looking at the increased risks around them, what is a trauma-informed approach, and then thinking specifically about the experience of displaced people. So for those of you who are working in a call centre environment and taking calls from people who have experienced recent adversity and trauma in conflict, then some of this stuff may actually be things that you can put in place in a very, very short space of time. But it also gives you some understanding of the ongoing issues that people may experience. So if you get contact with people further down the line once they've come to the UK, you can perhaps understand a little bit more how they are dealing with what they've experienced and what support they might need. So to start, we're just going to talk a little bit about stress and three different types of stress that are part of everyday life for many people. The first one is positive stress. So this is something that is really normal and something that's healthy actually to stress that we all experience in our lives, and it can be really essential to development as well. So this is the sort of thing that's characterised by a brief increase in heart rate or mild elevations in hormones. So positive things like just about to speak at a conference and you get that little bit of a nervous rush and perhaps your hands are a little bit shaky, and then you go out and then you deliver a really good speech because that adrenaline has helped you to focus on getting your message across. Or positive stress might be that a car's coming towards you and you jump out of the way because you're suddenly got a heightened sense of this is something that might hurt me and I'm going to move quickly, and that is something that's positive and developmental because we're learning from it. And these things happen every day to many of us. We actually need them as part of our own development, and as I said, it's very normal and very healthy response to what happens in our lives. The second type of stress is something called tolerant stress. So this is where the body is activated to a greater degree. So our alert systems are heightened because we're experiencing something that's more severe or perhaps longer lasting, such as a bereavement, an injury, or even a natural disaster. But the key about this is that it's time limited. And if we are supported, if you're children by adults, then we can overcome some of the perhaps negative responses to this type of stress. So for a child, we can support them to adapt the brain and other organs to recover from what might have been damaging effects if that support hadn't been there. But this sort of stress is also something that we will all experience in our lives. We will all experience bereavement. Some of us might experience something where we've spent time in hospital recovering from injury, but these things are things that we can recover from, that we can overcome. And although they may be longer lasting, with the right support, we're able to cope with our tolerant stress. And then the third category of stress is something called toxic stress. And this can occur when we have frequent or prolonged adversity in our lives. And these are sort of situations where we might be experiencing physical abuse or emotional abuse at home, family hardship or prolonged exposure, which can actually in children affect brain development and other sort of organ systems and increase the risk of stress-related disease and cognitive impairment into adult years. But for toxic stress to be something that's occurring, then it has to be a prolonged or frequent thing that's happening in our lives. And it seems to be that these things are things like physical abuse. If you think around some of the experiences that people have had in conflict and some of the conflicts that have gone on for many years, We will find children, for example, that were born in Syria and know nothing else other than conflict situations where they're frequently afraid for their lives. They've experienced violence on a daily basis, or homes have been destroyed around them. So in the conflict situation, then this toxic stress for children can be something because they have known no different or nothing else. And if you're in that prolonged exposure, then adults will be experiencing that as well. So the difference being that this is something that will carry on and is ongoing, even perhaps when you've been removed from the immediate situation that's causing it. So here's a short video that explains a little bit more about the impact of toxic stress. It talks about children because it's explaining about how that might manifest in a child in a school situation. But thinking about adults who are exposed to this level of stress over a period of time, the same sorts of feelings and behaviours may occur as a result.
The reality is that we all need a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of anxiety to perform well. If we don't care about that exam that we're going to have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. If we're going to cross the street and a truck is coming at us, we have release of adrenaline. We have release of a hormone that we call cortisol. We want to jump out of there, and adrenaline and cortisol are going to help us do that. So there's that good amount of stress. But if all day long you're feeling like a truck is coming at you, day after day after day, that's going to take a toll on the body.
So the kid next to them hits them, or the teacher reprimands them in a way that they're uncomfortable with, right? Literally what they're feeling, that activation is like there was a truck coming at them.
So we can see that if you're exposed to that level of stress over that prolonged period of time, then actually that can affect your everyday life and how you respond to things that perhaps other people would just get over and see as just kind of a normal occurrence. So that raising the hand or poking somebody in the classroom that might otherwise just be like brushed off, for that person who's experiencing that level of stress is just a reenactment of that feeling. And there's actually a number of things to think about in terms of stress and the trauma response. In children, there can be an actual impact on brain development as part of this, because toxic stress from trauma in childhood can cause that overdevelopment of a life-preserving part of the brain. So this is why it's really important to recognise where children have exposed to this sort of stress and to put that support in place really quickly if we can, to help with that recovery and prevent that overdevelopment. But as I said, this can be something that's happening to anybody at any age, and particularly during a conflict situation where they feel that there is that a threat to survival every day, or violence or other things happening around them, then we might see this toxic stress playing out. So just a little bit more about what that actually looks like. Here is a diagram that shows what happens in a normal stress situation. When I say normal, the sorts of stress that perhaps you and I might experience on a day-to-day basis. So what happens is that we are at rest, as we are at the moment, and a threat comes in. So that threat might be as simple as somebody just going boo or jumping out at us, or perhaps something hurting us, or perhaps something a little bit more sustained than that in terms of an argument or something happening outside that we're concerned about. Whatever it is a threat to us, and therefore we have a chemical reaction to that, as the video explained. You know, there are things that happen. Cortisol is kind of flowing around, as is adrenaline, and we go into a mode which we call fight or flight, or you might know it as freeze or flop. Basically, we are in a state where we make a decision about what we are going to do in reaction to this threat. And depending on circumstances and depending on personality, sometimes we choose to do one of those things. We might stand up and kind of fight off what it is that we're threatened by, or we might run away, or we might decide that we're just going to kind of literally let it happen and hope that the outcome is not so bad. But whatever happens at that point, when that has stopped, when we have gotten over whatever it is that has threatened us, we then go through a period of exhaustion. Thank goodness that's over. We might then turn to a friend and go, oh, that was quite funny, wasn't it? Or whatever might be that sort of exhaustive recovery period, in the sense that the threat has gone and now we are kind of bringing ourselves back to the position that we started in at rest. And that means that we have recovered from that experience. And that would be an example perhaps of tolerant threat stress, or maybe even positive stress in some situations. If you think about, that example of an exam, following an exam, you might be exhausted. Then you go through a period of recovery and you're back to normal. But this is something that we will all experience at some point, and we might recognise in terms of that journey. When we're experiencing something in terms of chronic stress or toxic stress, and we have that example of, if that's in childhood, then it can have that overdevelopment of the life-preserving part of the brain as part of it. We are in that fight or flight mode in terms of a constant fear. So the experiences that we're having, the adversity that we're experiencing, that kind of threat sense is with us all the time. And what that can create is something called a fixed allostatic load, in the sense that we are completely overwhelmed by that threat and by the things that are causing it. So, if we're experiencing sexual abuse in the home or physical violence in the home, and that is a continual thing, it's over a long period of time, that keeps happening, then we are stuck in that fight or flight mode. And that can have a real impact, not only on our physical health, but also on our mental well-being. It accumulates over time as we are exposed more and more to that feeling of fight or flight and the position that we're in. So that's why we get people who are constantly in that state when they've experienced some of these more prolonged traumas and adversities. So what does that actually look like? So if somebody has had a long exposure, or even a short exposure, but to toxic stress in something that that's been continual and chronically stressful, we might start to see some of the effects of that trauma. And sometimes we only see it when perhaps the trauma, the immediate threat, has actually diminished. And one of the things that we must remember in terms of people who have experienced this sort of level of trauma in conflict, or in the journey to the UK, or whatever they've experienced in their life, they might also be experiencing things in their home before any of this happened. So this could be a cumulative effect of a number of different things. But sometimes these effects only play out when actually they're in a place of more relative safety, or perhaps that they're in a different environment. So we may see this further down the line. It might not be some of the immediate reactions when people first arrive. So some of the things that you might expect to see from somebody who is responding to the effects of stress and trauma are things like being always prepared to fight or flee, as I said, in that constant state of high anxiety and fighting off the threat or whatever it might be. So they seem to be always anxious and on edge and ready to kind of either run or to fight. And you'll see that play out in terms of things like they may seem impulsive in some of the decisions they make, or they might feel or want to be disengaged from other people and hide away from some of the things that they're being asked to participate in, perhaps. If they're in school or education, that might play out in terms of struggling to learn, struggling to concentrate, having what's perceived to be an edgy or hot-tempered kind of personality, and really struggling to kind of build relationships with others, and feeling all the time hypertensive, looking over shoulder, constant state of anxiety, and just perpetually frightened. So those are the sorts of behaviours you might see. And if we don't understand, or we don't recognise that these sorts of things might be as a result of the trauma that people have experienced, then they might be just kind of described wrongly as that naughty child in school, or that difficult person, or the one that's got the kind of not very friendly personality, or it's difficult to engage. So it's really important to understand that this might not just be because they are a difficult person. This might be because there is an impact of trauma that's making these sort of things more about their behaviour. So I've used the term adverse childhood experiences a couple of times, and what I mean by that is that these are things, stressful experiences that happen during childhood that directly harm a child. And what we talk about is largely things in research terms that happen in the home. So things like sexual or physical abuse, domestic violence, substance misuse, parental separation, things that happen within that sort of home family environment, or affect the environment in which they live. So if you're growing up as a child in a household where there is domestic violence going on, or perhaps there's substance misuse, then that is an environmental factor as well as being directly harmed by it. So those are the sorts of things we talk about when we say ACEs. There are 10 ACEs in the research that's been done, starting in America in the early 1990s, through to more recent research that's been done in Wales. And there are 10 ACEs because we've chosen to look at the 10 that were set out in the original research and follow that through. But as we're talking about people who have also experienced that wider adversity and conflict, it's important to remember that there are not only 10. They are just the 10 that form the basis of the research. So outside of those standard 10, there are other types of childhood adversities that increase this risk of perhaps negative outcomes occurring in later life. And I'll talk about that in a second. And so what are the experiences that the group that we might be looking to support might have had, may be those 10 and others that have taken place. And some of the others, and this is not an exhaustive list, could be things like poverty, financial insecurity. So thinking about, suddenly losing your home, suddenly losing your source of income, suddenly losing your friends and family around you, you are plunged into financial insecurity, and those feelings of bereavement, perhaps loss, having to leave people behind, violence in the community, not being able to secure food, worrying about where your next meal might come from, as well as thinking about how you're going to get to safety, including concerns about the migration process and systems, and also concerns perhaps around being exploited or harmed during that journey. So there's a lot of things to think about in terms of adverse childhood experiences, but also adversity experienced in adulthood. These things will be happening to people whatever age they are. And although we won't have perhaps the playing out of the risk being heightened into adulthood from harm in childhood, we still have this adverse experience for people who are leaving their homes as a result of conflict. So I mentioned that there are some 10 ACEs that are set out in research, and in Wales there was a study done that looked at how many adults have been exposed to each of those 10. So this just gives you a sense of what are the 10, as I said, verbal, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect and physical neglect, parental separation, domestic violence, mental ill health, alcohol abuse, incarceration. So we're looking here at things that have been happening in the home, and this is as a result of that survey, what it is that people have experienced or have said that they have experienced in childhood. So this is interesting for us to understand, at a population level, what this looks like. As I said, some people who are coming here fleeing conflict may have had these sorts of things happening in their own lives before any of this happened. So they may have been growing up as adults, having experienced ACEs in childhood, or they might be, as a coping mechanism, perhaps turning to things like drugs and alcohol, or suffering from mental ill health and mental well-being as a result of some of this. So this is something that's happening in populations around about the same sort of levels around the world, and we need to be cognizant of that people have perhaps been experiencing this in their own childhood, and now in adulthood are trying to find ways to overcome that. But it's important to also understand that in some cases, when we're looking at the experience of conflict, let's take parental separation, for example. In this case, what we're talking about is in a relationship in the household. So the separation of parents, perhaps who've been in a relationship or now getting divorced. What we see in conflict situations is that parents are often separated by circumstances, so by geography, by the fact that one of them has had to leave at a different time to another. And as we're seeing now, often the male of the family is asked to join the armed forces or is conscripted. So therefore, there is a separation that's forced in a different way. It doesn't necessarily mean a relationship breakdown. So all of these things need to be thought about in slightly different contexts, but they are things that if the right support isn't provided, can increase a risk of further harm later in life. And what we talk about, and here's slightly different set of those more household, as we call them, adverse childhood experiences, but they are the same sort of experiences within the home, is that there are also some community environmental factors that can exacerbate or aggravate what's already happening, and vice versa. So here we see, you know, poverty, discrimination, disruption, violence, poor housing, and some of those kind of lack of opportunities and social mobility and economic kind of issues that play into the experience of adversity in childhood, and perhaps sometimes can prevent people from getting the support they need because they don't have access through structural inequality or because of the violence that's going on in their community to some of the things that would help them to overcome what's going on in the household. So in a conflict situation, we see perhaps some of these more community environmental aspects come into the fore because they are whereas they provide the context for others in a conflict situation, they provide, you know, more than the context. This is the experience of everyday life. So we need to look at this holistically, and we need to understand the impact of all of them on people and individuals. So when we talk about increased risk, when we look at people who have no ACEs versus people who have had 4 or more, we see that there is an increased risk of poorer mental health and well-being, but also things like criminality and health harming behaviours. But for the purposes of this training, I think we're going to focus more on the mental health and well-being aspects. So remember here, this is for people with 4 or more ACEs, so 4 or more of those 10 that you've just seen, but have had no access to support or to the protective factors, as we call them, that help people to overcome these experiences. So it doesn't mean that if you've had adversity in your life, you are definitely going to be more likely to be suffering with poorer mental health. What it means is that without that direct support and recognition of the things that help you cope with that, then there is an increased risk. And I think if we're looking at the experience of people fleeing from conflict in particular, some of those structures, such as healthcare systems, such as education systems, such as people that work within that and provide some of that support, have been taken away. So, you know, we're clearly kind of having more issues in terms of accessing perhaps people that were previously there and provided those sort of factors that help people to overcome. But it's really interesting to think about what the sort of likely impact might be on people that are struggling in terms of that lack of support to overcome adversity, because in terms of mental health and well-being, they are 6 times more likely to have rarely or never felt optimistic about the future, or to have felt useful. And here we see as well things like struggling to deal with problems well, or to be able to make up their own mind about things. So again, this adversity or trauma that people have experienced can have a direct impact, if the right things aren't in place, on their mental health and well-being, and it's important to recognise that. There is also an increased risk of chronic disease and health service use, and we put this into the training to really kind of explain over a period of longer time, particularly if children are in places where that access to healthcare is more difficult anyway. Those who have 4 or more ACEs and have no support to try and help them to overcome them are more likely, 4 times more likely to develop things like type 2 diabetes, or 3 times more likely to develop heart disease, 3 times more likely to develop respiratory disease. And you can see they're also more likely to call on health services and have a need to attend health settings. So when we look at some of the people who come to the UK for whatever reason, who are forced to migrate, we often see that there are some real difficulties in terms of chronic disease and health that may be down to just the lack of healthcare systems and treatment opportunities in the country that they left, but also might be as a result of the trauma that they've experienced and the lack of support for them to be able to overcome it. And often people will not be able to differentiate between mental health and well-being and chronic disease or physical health problems, because sometimes people don't recognise in themselves that they're suffering from mental ill health. They might just see physical symptoms. The two are absolutely interlinked. So it's really important not to just assume that somebody might be physically affected and not mentally affected, and vice versa, because often it's difficult for people to articulate it. But if there has been a prolonged exposure to adversity and trauma, or even a short exposure to extreme adversity, then some of these things might start to be some of the impacts of that if the right support is not in place. But there are things that can be put in place to help to support people who might have experienced some of these things, and we call them protective factors. And it's really important to understand that despite that experience of toxic stress, if we put it in that environment, or the experience of adversity in childhood or even in adulthood, healing can occur. People can overcome. And actually some of the people who come to the UK as refugees and asylum seekers in particular are some of the most resilient and, you know, that have really overcome some of the most incredible adversity, but go on to leave such positive lives. So there's real examples of how people can heal from what they've experienced. And often this healing process is really supported by a safe, stable, nurturing relationship and a combination of other factors to really help. So for a child, that would mean a building of a trusted relationship with an adult. For adults, it means that kind of relationship with people around them that can help them to overcome what they've experienced. And we call the overall kind of how you overcome and cope with adversity and trauma in the life course is something called resilience. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't ever focus on the cause of that adversity and trauma. It certainly doesn't mean that, you know, we should dismiss all the prevention work or the attempts to try and stop these things happening in the first place. But we have to accept that in some circumstances they will happen, and they have happened. So what is it that we can then put in place to ensure people are equipped to overcome that adversity, and particularly in a conflict situation where, you know, the opportunity to stop it happening has now gone. So how do we then think about what it is that we could all do to help people in this situation? And as I said, one of the key ones is that one or more stable caring child and adult relationship. So children who are still with a parent, or children who are able to access a relationship such as with a grandparent or with a trusted adult that may be, you know, part of their social structure, perhaps education, perhaps youth work, whatever it might be. That's a really important thing that will help them to kind of overcome what they've been experiencing. Other things are also thinking about how you manage some of those behaviours that we saw earlier, and the emotions that are experienced when you're trying to cope with what's happened to you. So thinking about being equipped to recognise when you need support, how to manage, you know, that fear, that anger, that anxiousness, to be able to get through the day. And some of the things that are important to that as well is that feeling of hope, that feeling that you can overcome this, and this is not, you know, what your life has to be, and that you are in a bit more control of your destiny. So coming to somewhere that maybe it feels safer, being able to make decisions about that are really important aspects of this overall ability to cope with what you've experienced. So being able to be in control of your life and to overcome that hardship is a really important aspect. And then another aspect is being involved and connected. So the importance of having community around you, having somebody or a group of people that you feel connected with, whether that's, you know, through your faith or through your interests, or perhaps just, you know, in terms of sharing a common language or sharing a heritage or an ethnicity. Some of that is, you know, can be created, some of that can be facilitated. If people arrive in the UK and do not know where to go to find perhaps people of a similar faith, for example, or somewhere that they can pursue those interests, then perhaps facilitating that is really important to help them to feel involved and connected. But again, it's back to that choice, it's back to that decision around what's best for them and where they feel that their needs would be most met. So that's the 4 building blocks of resilience that really help people to overcome what they've experienced. So just to recap, the resilience is the ability to adapt well in the face of adversity. We're not saying that we shouldn't recognise that the cause of the adversity in the first place is important to address. And having that relationship with a trusted adult during childhood is one of the most important aspects of preventing, mitigating and tackling ACEs and trauma. So how can we actually go forward in terms of understanding that the people we might be speaking to, who ring us for support, or that we might be interacting with, have experienced some form of trauma? So one of the things that we've been talking about for quite some time in Wales is the principle of being trauma informed. And this is a way that we can think about how we recognise those experiences are possible for anyone, and thinking about how that knowledge of that trauma or adversity is then incorporated in what we do and how we do it, to take account of not only an individual's early life experiences, but also the experiences that they've recently had. So we don't necessarily need to know what all those individual experiences of adversity and trauma are. What we are doing is saying we understand that it's a possibility for you. So therefore, we are going to make sure that we recognise that. This is not about unpicking necessarily what those traumas are, because that's something that may be done further down the line or with more specialist support. For us, this is just about saying we recognise this, and this is a way now that we are going to ensure that what we do doesn't make you feel more traumatised or re-traumatised, and that we are taking forward actions that hopefully will help and support you. One of the key elements of being trauma-informed in approach is safety. So ensuring that situations and environments are places where people feel emotionally, physically, spiritually and culturally safe. So establishing that safe place is really, really important to building trusted relationships, which we'll come on to in a second. So when people are welcoming people who fled from conflict into their homes, the idea there is that they are providing a safe environment, at least in terms of housing and some of the basic needs of shelter, food, etc. So hopefully that part of the whole process is to ensure that this aspect is taken care of. But sometimes we don't know necessarily what safety means to someone, so it's important that we understand and ask, what would make you feel safe? What are the sorts of things that might actually support that, particularly spiritual and cultural safety? That might be, as I say, connecting people with others that can help support that in terms of faith or in terms of interest, but also ensuring that people aren't isolated from others who they would feel safe with. So thinking about that, if you're having a conversation over a very short space of time, it might be important to think about in terms of that phone call. Are you creating a safe space? Are you explaining what this is about? Are you understanding that, just talking to someone, whether it's face-to-face via video or whether it's just simply in terms of listening down the end of the phone, how can you improve that situation? How can you ensure that this is the right time for them to be discussing it in this way, and to reassure around the safety aspects of speaking in that manner? One of the things that many people experience when they are forced to migrate is often things like psychological or coercive control from state authorities, particularly when law and order is broken down, and some of the perpetrators of violence are actually people in positions of power. So we have to remember that they may have experienced things like surveillance via telephone or via the means. So explaining that this is not that, but understanding why people might find it difficult would be a really important aspect of this. Another aspect that's really important if we're trying to operate the principles of trauma-informed practice is thinking about where those opportunities are that we can offer choice and control. to a person to help promote that healing and avoid re-traumatization. So really thinking about where are the opportunities in a conversation to say, you know, what would work best for you? Here are your options. How would you like to take this forward? Understanding the boundaries, of course, of where there is choice and where there isn't, but where there is, that flexibility to kind of offer an ability to choose between actions. So an example might be even the time of day that someone is able to speak to you, or, you know, trying to understand perhaps what the preferred kind of method or conversation might be. So really thinking about where possible to emphasize that choice. And if we're supporting people who have really had no choice in terms of they've been forced to flee from their homes, what choices are available in the new arrangements that they find themselves in, and really emphasizing that, you know, that they are able to make decisions, and that they would be supported in doing so, but understanding that that's the situation that they're in. And this all boils down really to that collaboration. So what we're not doing is kind of imposing a set of ways of being or ways of working. We're trying to think about how do we collaborate and share power through that inclusive approach. So looking for those opportunities for choice, but also in terms of decision making. You know, what do you think we should be doing here? What's the need that you think we could be addressing? What is there anything that you're already aware of that might help? But also seeking to find out whether or not what you're doing is helpful. Is there anything different that could be done as a result of the interactions that you're having? You know, would it be better to have a different sort of conversation? So it's a partnership approach. It's not an imposition, and trying then to ensure that people then feel safe in that conversation and they feel they have an element of choice in what they're doing. And we want people to really feel like that they have an opportunity to build on the strengths that they already have, so they can realise that they actually do have the ability to kind of move on, to be resilient, and to have strength in what has been a really difficult and adverse set of circumstances. So by drawing out from them what those strengths are, encouraging, looking for opportunities to promote them, if they have particular skill or particular interest, encouraging again the importance of that and how that will be valued and could be valued by others. So that again, that feeling post adversity or during adversity that, you know, that you can't add any value, that life perhaps has no meaning, is a really important aspect of this, to really kind of look at that and say, you know, what could people do to bring meaning to their own lives and to the lives of others. So all those opportunities must be looked for in conversations, in terms of really helping people to see that they have strength and that they're able to recognise that and to take it forward. And then if we are doing all of these things, hopefully that we will also then be establishing a relationship that is maximising trust. So in order to do so, we must be really clear about what the relationship is and what we are trying to achieve from it. So, you know, if you are someone that's perhaps hosting people, then some of these things must be set out at the very beginning in terms of the expectations around the relationship, but also what's important. So thinking about those boundaries, thinking about things like, you know, personal space, private space, times of the day when people are coming in and out, friends coming round, you know, those sorts of things are all the kind of issues that can get in the way of relationships if those boundaries are not established. But at the same time, thinking about, you know, what is it that you, perhaps as the person who is providing advice on the phone, can do to be really clear about what you can do and where you might need to take advice or to signpost to somewhere else, so that expectation is managed, so that the trust is established in terms of, you know, you're not trying to get out of answering a question. It's about importance of clarity and being able to provide sound and confident advice. So even if it's a very short relationship of a couple of phone calls or one phone call or whatever, it's still important to ensure that the person who you're interacting with understands that they are in a position of safety, and that they can trust you with their information, but also with you know, what they may or may not tell you about their lives, and that that you are in a position where that you can actively help or seek others to support that. But trust is really important, and for many people fleeing conflict, that's the most difficult aspect, because they have lost trust in authority in many cases, or in the people around them, because of the experiences they've had on the journey to the UK, where people have abused that trust, tried to exploit them, or have basically taken them away from anybody who would be able to provide that opportunity. So it's a really difficult and challenging aspect for people who have fled conflict, but it's so important to establish that element of trust as soon as possible. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about specific experiences of people who've been displaced, because as I said, they're adverse childhood experiences and trauma can happen to anybody in life, and it depends on those protective factors and what's available as to how people are able to overcome them. But when we have a situation where people have been forced to flee, perhaps are entering systems such as the asylum system, or are refugees, or in this case are forced to flee their homes and have applied for visas to come to the UK, then this experience of ACEs and trauma can be quite different, or on top of the sort of things that we've just been discussing. So I'm going to show you a video to start with, which is quite hard hitting, but it emphasises some of the things that people can experience. The voices in the video are children who have largely fled conflict and have travelled across Europe in search of safety through asylum or refugee routes. However, the experience of people on the borders of countries, waiting for visa applications to be progressed, having to travel through a number of countries in order to get to somewhere where they can come to the UK, they are now, I think, at risk of some of these experiences as well. So it's important to understand that this might be some of the things that have happened to people. It is about children, but as I say, adults as well are experiencing adversity and trauma, as you will see.
انقدر میترسیدم از همه چی. آمدیم در کوها تا زانوی ما پایای ما یخ زده بود، اصلا نمیتونستم راه برم، نفسم بالا نمیومد، فکر میکردم همینجا میمیرم. رحت ودعت رفقاتي، اجا وقفنا الجيش السوري، قلت لهم عنا شهيد بالشو اسمه، لأنه صغير شايفيني صغير لحسدوني.
The big guns that I had, I've never had before. They were looting of people's properties, killing, raping, burning of houses. All this I witnessed with my eyes.
پدر و مادر ندارم. مادرم 6 سال قبل فوت کرده. اندازه یک آدم 25-26 ساله کار میکنه. با خوابم هم همچین چیزا رو فکر نمیکردم که همچین چیزا و همچین اتفاقا پیش میفته.
Desde que me ve a mí dijo que él me llevaba hambre a mí, dijo. A esta chinita le vuela del ojo, dijo. Y cuando me quedé adentro venía él con otro muchacho y incluso los dos abusaron de mí.
نحن بس وصلنا للمياه الإقليمية وقف البلد ما عاد اشتغل. وقتها هاج البحر وصارت تشتي علينا المطر كتير. متغيرة كتير كتير كتير، ما عم بثق بحدا. إنه كيف يعني الواحد إنه أول شي الغربة بتأسي القلب، الغربة بتأسي القلب.
ከብኔሮም ዘጋጠመና ችግር ኣብ ሊብያ 4 ወርሒ ኮፍ ኢልና እውን ተጨዊና ገለ እንታይ እሞ ትገብር ኣማራፂ የለን ساعة أماراتي
جبت معي لعبة بس ضاعت. دبدوب ولا ددو. أعطوني يا رفقاتي بالمدرسة. ضيعته وإحنا عم نتهرب، ضيعته بالماي. كان في طين كتير بالأرض، وقع بالماي ما عاد شفته. كانت تحكي I love you وهيك شغلات. بعدين أهلي قنعوني عشان مستقبلك سافر وإحنا بنلحقك بعدين إن شاء الله.
So you can see from that film some of the things I've been talking about in terms of that trauma-informed approach. Children there saying that they didn't trust anyone, they had no choices, they felt alone, lonely. These were children, obviously, that some of them had travelled on their own, but many were travelling in small groups or with family members and experiencing those sorts of hardships. One of the things that is also really prevalent during conflict, both in terms of domestic and violence that occurs during conflict itself, is gender-based violence. We know, for example, that during conflict, relationships become more strained, and often we see an increase in domestic abuse within interpersonal relationships. But actually, during conflict, gender-based violence, violence against an individual based on their gender, is an actual integral part of violence that takes place. So it can be physical, emotional, or sexual violence, or threats of violence, coercion, and deprivation of liberty. And you know, one of the most concerning aspects of conflict is actually not just the violence that takes place in the physical form, but also what can happen to people as they continue their journey from fleeing the conflict itself. Most often we talk about men's violence against women. That is the most prevalent form of gender-based violence. But during conflict, we also see violence against other men and boys, and particularly violence based on sexual orientation. So be aware that this is something that may have started to happen to people as they fled from Ukraine, and is commonly an experience of particularly women and girls who have fled conflict from around the world. It's a whole other training kind of session, but it's part of that understanding of the overall adversity and trauma that people you may speak to have faced, that there may be a significant amount of gender-based violence the longer that the conflict goes on. So why are we concerned about adversity and trauma in asylum seeking and refugee populations in particular, but also in people that are fleeing conflict more generally and are not labelled as asylum seekers or refugees as such? It's important because if we understand better that experience of, in this case, adverse childhood experiences, but adversity and trauma more broadly, and the longer term impact of that amongst people who come to the UK to seek sanctuary or to be safe, then we are more able to provide the right support to ensure they can go on to live happy, healthy and productive lives. So having this better understanding of the sorts of things that people may have experienced should enable us then to think about what is it that we can do, what can we put in place to provide those factors, those protective factors that help people to heal. So research that was done by Public Health looked at what the literature said about the risk of adverse childhood experiences and the migration journey. So for the purposes of this training, this is about children, but we can think about this in terms of young adults and adults themselves as well. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the adverse childhood experiences that happen within the home. Set out again, there's 10 there in terms of the physical, emotional abuse and neglect, etc. That is something that is in that sort of more domestic environment. So as I said, there are people, families, individuals that will be supported in the coming weeks and months that may have experienced some of this in their home. There is no difference to the populations of other countries around the world in terms of the prevalence of adversity within the home. So remember that in terms of the context of the people in which we are working with. But in addition to what might have been going on in the home, we also see some broader adversity and different adversity that affects people who have had to flee. So before they've left the country that they may call home, so in this instance of Ukraine and more recent conflicts, the conflict has broken out. And as a result of that, we see an increase in things like physical, emotional and sexual abuse within the structures of that society. So things happening within schools, in communities, or as I said before, by authority figures who are now using that form of abuse as a way to control, frighten, and as a form of violence. They will often see violence towards other people as well. So there is that fear of violence towards an individual themselves, but also then witnessing what's happened to people around them, friends, neighbours, community, or people that they don't know. But whatever that looks like, that experience of seeing violence happen to others as well as experiencing it yourself can be extremely traumatic. There is also the destruction of homes, the experience of bombs, and in some cases having to commit those acts of violence themselves. So if we think about people being conscripted to the army, being asked to volunteer to fight, they are going to now have to carry out acts of violence that they may never have had to do before. Conflict often brings about people imprisoned or abducted. That might occur later down the line at a larger scale, but it's certainly something that forms part of daily life for many people who have escaped conflict in many situations. And one of the things that you'll see now is prevalent across the whole of the migration journey is that severe deprivation of basic necessities: food, water, shelter, hygiene, health. During conflict, the infrastructures that are most commonly hit in modern warfare are those that support the survival of the population. So you'll see hospitals targeted, schools targeted, which all adds to the overall deprivation of basic necessities. Then on the migration journey itself, we have the potential for exposure to more physical, emotional and sexual abuse, sometimes again by the authorities within the countries that people have to travel through. Not all state authorities are not all of them are regulated. Violence is often commonplace as part of the work that they do, and you have smugglers and traffickers who are facilitating often people to get to different countries. Sometimes that means that they are being asked to pay huge amounts of money, so there's a financial burden there, but there's also a risk of abuse. And as you saw in the film, particularly women and girls are at most risk of rape and sexual violence from smugglers and traffickers. And also there's a difference in immigration systems, detention centres and refugee camps around the world. Again, this is an area where we know that there are really high levels of gender-based violence, in particular refugee camps where people stay for prolonged periods of time. There are stories around mothers having to facilitate the marriage of their girls to prevent them being abused by other men in the camp. And these are places that are not safe, and that feeling of safety is not necessarily supported by a refugee camp, despite the fact that people generally see that as somewhere that people have gone to be safe. Again, we see ongoing witnessing of violence towards others and the experience of it, and that ongoing deprivation of basic necessities. Once they've arrived in the country that they are migrating to, so whatever that might be, it might be the forced migration as a result of conflict, it might be that they have chosen to migrate for other reasons, but they have arrived in the destination that they will either claim asylum in or that they have a visa for, and sometimes those destinations, if they're not the UK in particular, also have systems that are not necessarily free of violence, and in many cases they can be treated as citizens that are less deserving of protection. So again, there's an ongoing witnessing of violence. There is that continued sort of keeping people in poverty. They're reliant on the state, and it's quite difficult to kind of overcome some of those things. So what this research is saying is that you can experience adversity and trauma at every stage. It's not just in the conflict that you've left, it's actually on the journey to the UK in this instance, or wherever you would be hoping to make your final destination in terms of reaching safety. But it doesn't stop as a result of just leaving the country that you would call home. And what does this do? So the impact on families, parenting, and that risk of adverse childhood experiences if families have been through that experience of migration is high. So we see migration and its causes affecting family functioning through things like poor parental mental health, parents and adults struggling to cope with what they've experienced, and that then having an impact on the children in the family. Changing family roles, which is really interesting because often children, particularly if they can enter an education quite quickly, are able often to pick up languages, perhaps faster than some of the adults. You saw from the film that the children were being described by the parents as the future, their hope. They felt that they were taking or seeing adult kind of experiences and certainly taking on more adult roles. What you might see as a result of that in terms of settling in the country where people have made the destination is that if the children are learning the language more quickly, they're expected to perhaps interpret for other members of the family, read documents, understand the welfare system or the healthcare system, and that can have a real impact not only on the children in terms of having to be launched into that adult world, but also on the adults and feeling that they're not able to protect their children from that. And that often plays out as well in differences in acculturation rate. So, if you are unable to pick up the language as quickly, if you're unable to get work, if you're unable to kind of put yourself into some of those structures that help with all of those sorts of things, you can find that sometimes children and adults have a different rate in terms of settling in, of feeling part of the community, and feeling that they are being integrated. There are also ongoing concerns around safety. So there will be concerns largely due to the experience that they've had of parents over children and whether they are safe, whether the people they're interacting with are going to harm them, but also that ongoing fear of things like people in authority, who to trust, what it is that might happen to them in public places or in private spaces. So that ongoing concern stays with people much longer than just from the point of arrival. And we might see some of those changes in behaviour. So some of the things we talked about before might not be immediate. People might seem quiet or withdrawn, but then further down the line, some of those emotions might start to come out, and that anxiety and fear might translate into perhaps some of the things that we talked about earlier. So those changes need to be recognised, that that over time the impact of trauma and adversity might play out in different ways. There's also health and well-being impacts, because when we particularly look at refugees, there's research that says that up to a third of young refugees that settle in European countries are thought to be affected by mental ill health. It says disorder there. That's because it's been something that's been diagnosed. So you can probably understand that there are many people that have not had a diagnosis in terms of mental health. It is something that will be prevalent within people who have experienced conflict, and it's important that they are able to access the support that they need. However, taking a trauma-informed approach will help in terms of what people can do who aren't specialists, who aren't medically trained. We're not expected all suddenly become experts in managing mental health. So those central principles of trauma-informed practice are ways that we can all support people who are perhaps struggling with their mental health and well-being. But it also, as I mentioned before, plays out as well in terms of physical health problems. So people fleeing conflict have often experienced things and been unable to get health care as a result of it. So they may be carrying injuries, but also, in terms of some of the experience of conflicts, there may also be things like sexually transmitted infections. So those physical health problems sometimes are kind of hand in hand with the mental health problems, but the physical health problems are the ones that people find easier to articulate. So again, it's thinking about what is the overall health and well-being of people that we're looking to support. It can also affect academic achievement. So again, linked to struggles with mental health, people who are attempting to, children who are going to school, or perhaps younger adults who are returning to education, or people who are trying to kind of enter into work, might find it quite difficult to kind of achieve perhaps what they were achieving before, because it can affect that concentration and that sense, of course, of being constantly on edge and fearful. So might see performance or achievement affected. And then also those behavioural problems, which may again start to play out in terms of people that being described as that naughty child or that difficult person, because they are struggling to regulate those emotions, and how that plays out is something that we would recognise as perhaps a disorder, but what they are experiencing is trauma and the natural kind of reaction to some of that. So thinking around some of those problems being as a result of that. But also there's some really positive impacts of all of this. So despite the fact that children and adults have experienced this huge amount of adversity and trauma, actually some of the outcomes can be positive. In many cases, people have that really strong sense of meaning and direction. They are grateful for the opportunity to be safe and to be able to kind of find a path for their lives, to recover and to hope to return to their homes, obviously, in the future. So there are some positives that come out of this, and this is where we talk about that strengths-based model, looking for those opportunities to empower people and to really build on some of the things that make them feel positive and that they can contribute. Returning to the risk of poor mental health, one of the things that we've seen from the literature around people who have been forced to migrate is that often there is this cumulative sense of adverse experiences. So not only what may be going on in the home, not only what may have historically happened to the adults that are presenting now in their own childhood, but also, on top of that, the adversity that they've experienced as a result of conflict and all the things that mentioned before. So often that cumulative impact means that the risk of poor mental health is increased. And when we have children arriving on their own, they are certainly more likely to have had multiple experiences of adversity. We also see that family and parental difficulties can increase the risk as well. So in this case, often, that separation, that forced separation of husband and wife or partners or parents, and different members of the family being in different locations, struggles to maintain contact, but also struggles in relationships brought on by the stress of all of that. So we start to see some of that being really exacerbated. And also this can be exacerbated by some of the lower levels of social support. So being taken away from peers, being isolated perhaps from others who have been through the same experience, that can also lead to some of the increases in poor mental health. So it's really important that peer support is also maintained somehow as far as possible, because that social support, that commonality of experience can be really helpful to somebody who's experienced trauma and is struggling with mental health. The more times people are moved around in a system, and this largely relates to the immigration system around asylum, the increased in risk of mental health as well, because you're trying to settle, to create some sort of routine and structure, and then you're moved again, can be really disruptive. And there's also a sense that the perceived or real, I think, discrimination in the host country. So the place that you've come to for safety, actually there is, examples of racism, of xenophobia, of hate crime, things like that. It can happen to people, or they feel it's happening to them, and that again can exacerbate their mental health. That feeling that they've escaped from one form of adversity, and now they're experiencing another in the place that they hope to be safe. But there are other factors as well in terms of that association with resilience and growth following adversity and trauma. So as I keep hopefully emphasising, that even in the face of prolonged and severe adversity, if there's enough of the right things and the resources that people can access, they can go on to maintain healthy, functioning lives. So what we also need to think about and focus on is those positive personality attributes that people will bring. So, there will be people who have real positive thinking around their circumstances. They're looking to the future. They're seeing this as a short-term issue. They want to have a positive impact. So looking further down the line, either hoping to return or to contribute to society. So they're really, positive in their outlook. They do have a sense that life has meaning, so the opposite to some of those mental health outcomes that we saw earlier from the ACEs experience. So believing that there is a purpose, that they are here to have meaning is really important. So we can draw on people that share that, and they are often very pro-social, those sorts of people, so willing to bring others with them and to try and help and support other people. We also see, in terms of people fleeing conflict, that despite being separated from members of their family, friends, communities, there is often a very positive early attachment. So the relationship between parents and their children in the face of this adversity, it can be very, very strong and positive. And the family often is a good family in terms of functioning. There's often extended networks, so people have had to draw on other members of their family and come together, and where there's good parental mental health, then that's really supportive in terms of that context. So those sorts of things should be also looked for and kind of built upon. And then there's also the aspects around the larger social world, and thinking about things like the sorts of good peer relationships that can develop. Often schools play a really strong role in that, so being safe and supportive, encouraging those relationships, supporting children, and also the involvement of faith and religious institutions and the wider community. So involving people, connecting people, bringing them into communities and structures that enable them to feel empowered and to build on the strengths that they have is really important. And then we see people really coming towards a really positive outlook and supporting each other. And one of the things that I ask people to do at the end of this training is having sat through all of that and thought about the impacts and the experiences that people may have had, that you are either supporting, speaking to, working with. One of the most important things that you can do is to try and think about, how would you feel if this was you? If nothing else, one of the key kind of supportive, protective factors is the ability to listen to somebody. The ability to kind of empathise, be compassionate and be kind. And if someone feels that they are listened to, then you're on the starting point of building that trust. But part of that really needs people to think about, this isn't just happening to those other people. What would it feel like if it had happened to me? What would I feel like if I was suddenly thrown into a conflict situation? And you see that violence every day. You can hear the guns and the bombs. People have left, some have had to go to become soldiers, or your neighbourhood has been destroyed. Obviously, if you haven't experienced that, we can't know the full extent of what that feels like, but certainly we can think about, if it did, what the sorts of things that would be the reaction that we might have. And I think that's really helpful in terms of when you do hear what people have been through, that you have had that kind of moment of reflection to think, well, I think I can understand why you feel like that, or I can certainly empathise with what's happened to you. So I say, really kind of important aspect of listening to people, believing them, making them feel like you are part of their story in terms of just having someone to share it with, is really important, and that kind of compassionate, kind, empathetic engagement is really important. So taking some time to just think about how it would feel is a really key aspect of that. And with all this reflection that we've been through in terms of principles of trauma-informed practice, it's also important to think about, what does this mean to you? So when you are working in an environment where you are supporting people who've been through this level of trauma, what more could you or your service or your organisation do to maximise those opportunities for the principles to be trauma-informed? So as we start the process of engaging with people, of learning a bit more about what they've been through, it's really important to think about, you know, as an organisation that you work in, or in the process that you're following and the guidance that you have been given, are there any other opportunities to think about this differently? And to put in some of those elements where, you know, perhaps you can make someone feel a little more safe, or there might be an extra few minutes where if you just did that, then that trust might be developed. So really have a think about that, and I think it's important that you know, then you think as well, you know, how you might help others to look for those things that support that resilience. And also think about how it affects you personally. So, you know, if you're aware now of the importance of understanding that anyone might have experienced ACEs and trauma even before conflict, and then this accumulation of additional adversity, you know, how might that change the way that you interact towards them? How might you express that compassion? How might you build in more time to be able to listen to someone properly? And what might you do differently in your own practice? So really important to just take some time to think about what all this means for you. And then back to what I said at the beginning, this stuff is really difficult, and actually it's not about other people. So although we may not have all experienced having to flee conflict, we will have experienced stress and adversity in our lives, and some of us may have experienced some of the adverse childhood experiences I talked about earlier, or be going through now trauma in your lives. So don't think that this is about other people. It's about the people that you work with. It's about your family. It's about yourself. So it's important to recognise how you cope with stress, because if you're supporting people who've had a significant experience of it, there is also a risk that that trauma becomes secondary trauma for you. So, for example, I know that I cope with stress by going for a daily walk, which I enjoy, or I might have a glass of wine. That's okay. It's not okay if that becomes no walks and a bottle of wine a night. So you've got to recognise what you do to cope with that stress, but also recognise when that becomes a negative and when you might need to seek some more support. So really seek out from the start what support is provided by your organisation. So what is already in place, who your line manager is, where there might be other access to perhaps employee assistance, or to other mechanisms of support, occupational health, etc. Even if you don't think you need it now, it's really good practice to identify where those sources might be, so that if you do, then they're to hand and you're able to access them as quickly as possible. And also there's a role here, isn't there, about the people that you're working with, because if you're all working in an environment where you're managing your own stress, but also, you know, hearing on a daily basis what other people have been through, what's the best way to support each other? And one of the things that's really good to remember is the thing, like, you know, you go on holiday and they do the flight safety thing. And they talk about the oxygen masks, and they always say, don't they, make sure you fit your own mask before helping others. That's exactly the same in this context. If you are not looking after yourself, then you are not going to be able to help other people. So, you know, really be conscious of what the impact of all of this on you is, and make sure that before you help others, that you're able to do so from a position of being in a good place yourself. So, as I say, make sure you understand where you can go for additional support. There are national services that are available to you. So organisations such as Mind in particular provide help for coping with stress and issues in terms of mental health and well-being. Also, obviously, there are services that you can access through your GP in terms of mental health. If you want to have any more information about adverse child experiences, trauma, all of that sort of thing, then as part of my role, I manage something called the ACE Support Hub. And this you can find on Facebook, on Twitter, and we also have a website where you can have a look at some of the research, but also some of the more kind of practical aspects of this, and if you're interested, to get a bit more information about that. And just before I finish, here are some of the more national helplines for Wales and the UK. Here you can get support for any of those adversities that I mentioned, and broader than that. So thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure to provide this training for you. If there's any questions, then please contact me via the ACE Support Hub. But very grateful for you listening to me today, and best wishes for the role that you're now going to do.